Inheritance in SASS comes in two forms. The first form is selector inheritance, and the second one is property inheritance as well. So by using these two types of inheritance, they go hand in hand with producing a well-structured, well-managed style sheet. So I've already gone ahead and set the environment up, and you'll also notice I've declared a variable with a string that has no quotes. We will use this in a selector at a later date, but right now we want to concentrate on the inheritance of selectors. So let's first of all start out with a simple selector where I'm going to target an element with the ID of parent and give it the background color of green. Now let's create a selector within the parent selector. So this one is going to look for an element with the ID of child1, and it's going to have a background color of yellow and a font size of 1em. You'll notice that it's inherited from the parent selector. So we have the parent selector, which was hash parent, then we have a space, and then we have the hash child1. So this is what we mean by selector inheritance. Think of it like a family tree, and the CSS produced is very well structured. And we don't have to stop there. Let's add in another child selector to the main parent selector, and we'll call it child2. And give it the font weight of 200. And again, it's the same thing. We have the parent and then we have child2 in the produced CSS file. And you can keep going in this fashion by keep nesting in selectors into other selectors. So take child2, which is already nested in the parent selector, but now we're going to go into the child2 selector and we're going to add in another selector. And this selector is going to have the ID of inner child, and then we're going to look for the element with the class of content and apply a background color of blue. So now we have a two-step inheritance. We have the main parent selector, we have the child2 selector, and then finally we have the inner child and the class of content selector. So there's three selectors combined together and we have this really nice inheritance. Now let's say I want to extend onto the parent selector like we have been doing, but I don't want a space in there. So what I can do is use the ampersand. So I can say ampersand.hasClass, and then I can apply a background color, a font weight, and a font style. And you'll notice it will again inherit from the parent selector, so that's hash parent, and then there's no space in there, we have the .hasClass. So this selector will look for an element that has the ID of parent, but that same element must also have the class hasClass. And then those CSS properties will be applied. Also, we can use our EL variable within the parent and child selectors. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, save it, and you'll notice it will update accordingly. Also, this inheritance flows naturally with advanced child selectors that target multiple elements. So let's do that with child1. We'll target another element with the class of another and another element with the class of even more. Not only has the parent selector been appended to the start of this child selector, but also wherever there is a comma, the parent selector has also been appended as well. So now that's as far as I'd like to go with this part of the lecture. So I'm just going to comment out all of the CSS code that has been written currently. And we want to move on to the inherited properties and how to use the extend directive. The first step to sharing CSS properties is to add in a placeholder. We declare a placeholder by putting in the percentage sign and then giving the placeholder a name. Please stick to the traditional naming conventions within SASS, so no spaces and no special characters. And then we need to open and close our parentheses and then add in all of the CSS properties we'd like to share with multiple elements. Now, even if I was to save this SCSS file, there will be no CSS produced, and that's because this is just a placeholder. It is not actually going to produce any code in and of itself. What we need to do is we need to, let's say, target an element. So we need to set up another CSS selector. And then within the parentheses of that selector, we need to say @extend. And then we need to put in the percentage sign and the name of the placeholder. So I'm going to say shared. And with the produced code, you'll notice that it's taken our selector.content and placed it right where the placeholder was, which was shared. And now what we can do is also modify that placeholder selector. So I'm just going to put in the hash parent before it, and then after it, I'm going to put in look for the element with the class of child. And you'll notice it's done exactly the same thing again, where we have the shared placeholder, and it's taken the selector and just placed it right where the placeholder has been defined. Now let's also assume that this selector does not just have those properties associated with it. Yes, I want to share those properties with this selector, but I also want this selector to have its own unique properties applied to it. So I'm just going to add in a line height CSS property and save it. And you'll notice it's still a part of the shared properties, but it's now also got its own selector.content with the line height CSS property. Now let's see how the extend directive and the placeholder works with a selector that targets multiple elements. So this selector will target the element with the class of sign, it will target the video tag and also the image tag as well. Then we finally add in the @extend directive to extend onto the shared placeholder selector. Now what it will do is it will repeat that placeholder selector 3 more times for each one of those elements that we're targeting, so .sign, video, and image. So that is a really nice way to share all of the CSS properties across multiple elements. And also they can all have their own unique CSS properties applied to them. Now let's do something a little bit more interesting, where I can create another variable called list, and I'm just going to put in, let's say, element 1, then put a comma, then element 2, and then target another element as well. So we're targeting 3 different elements within this variable. And now what I'd like to do is take the list variable and use it in the selector down below where we're extending onto the shared placeholder. And so once I've done that, if I hit save, you'll notice it's repeated another 3 times that placeholder selector. And there we go, inheritance in a nutshell. And you can see how this can save you a lot of time and headaches. Now also on top of that, if I take a look at the SASS syntax, again, it's following the standard conventions with no ending semicolons and no encapsulation, which to me, I much prefer the SCSS syntax, especially when it comes to inheritance. There are ways that I can neaten this up, such as adding in more line breaks and so on and so forth, but overall, it's your personal preference. So, that is inheritance.